present video is a follow-up to this video where I lay down the foundations of my theory on Haki. So if you haven't watched that, please do so before you watch this one, otherwise you'll be, as we would say in my country, more lost than a blind man in a shootout, which is about as lost as Zoro. So, in the previous video, I introduced to you this fourth color of Haki, which I have named, as we don't have an official name for it, Nature Haki, or alternatively Breath Haki, where you change the nature of your Haki to match or mimic the breath or ki of different things. The breath of stone, of iron, of fire, of water, of electricity, etc. So in this video I want to delve a little bit deeper into this ability and show you how you can explain a lot more than the stuff that I had already mentioned in the previous video. Namely, Seimei Kikan, Laoji's Qigong, the secret to Kureha's youth, the power that Chopper is likely to use to become a doctor who can cure anything, Diable Jambe, a lot of different Zoro techniques, some Rokushiki abilities, and also to try to explain why this Haki, unlike armament, concourse, and observation, has not been rediscovered by the population at large, as in what makes it difficult to rediscover. Now, I did say that each of the colors of Haki are related to different forms of ambition, right? In this case, the power is to change the nature of your own Haki to be more like the nature of natural elements around you. At the same time, you use this change in nature to control these elements as if they were an extension of your own Haki. In a sense, this power lets you connect with natural elements to become closer to them. And so, in general, thematically, this power is linked to ambitions related to connecting, harmonizing, or becoming one with nature, with the natural world around you. And so to be able to change nature's flow in a way that is harmonious with it. So, Shen, the mind, manipulating vital chi through ambition is Haki. But what if we go a step further and use this Haki to manipulate Jing? This would mean to gain conscious control over your own body in ways that defy nature, in ways that defy your regular biology. This is the essence of Laoji's Qigong and of Seimei Kikan. And we see a reference to Seimei Kikan, that is life return or rebirth, in that chapter where Laoji talks about his Qigong. By Laoji's life hilariously leaving his body due to old age and then returning. But why is it that Seimei Kikan has this name of life return or rebirth? Well, you see, the Taoist notion of the afterlife could be a bit vague and diverge between writers. But roughly, life was seen as chi coming together and death was seen as chi dispersing. It was thought that there was this spiritual soul which would leave the body upon death. And then, as any other chi, it would return to the Tao. That is, of course, with the exception of some legendary figures, like the Yellow Emperor, who are often described as ascending to heaven upon death. But for example, your boy Ye Fashan, who allegedly upon death turned into a sword and then a pillar of smoke before ascending to heaven. May you rest in peace, Ye Fashan. We'll always remember you as the cool, non-anti-Semitic Ye. And of course, in the context of internal alchemy, longevity was determined by the most material of the three treasures, Jing. And thus, you can see why there will be a special focus in Neidan in uniting body and spirit and controlling Jing with the mind in order to replenish and preserve it. This would develop in ideas of uniting the three treasures via Qigong and creating a spiritual, immortal body out of Jing that will be fully unified with the individual's spirit. This was called the Young Body. And in the context of the interactions between Taoists and Buddhists, this was seen as a major point of division between the two. Taoist Nadan practitioners frequently argued that Buddhists focused exclusively on the spirit, on perceiving Buddha nature, while ignoring the body and longevity, and that as such, their nirvana would only result in them becoming like disembodied ghosts of sorts, or yin spirits. This is particularly expressed in a parable where a Taoist sage and a Buddhist sage have a contest in out-of-body spiritual projection. Yes, you heard it right. The Buddhist sage is able to send his soul to vast distances and see beautiful fields of flowers. He comes back and tells the others of what he was able to see with his soul in this faraway place. The Taoist sage also sends his soul to these faraway fields of flowers, but instead of just seeing it, is able to pick up a flower and bring it back. Especially with the interaction of Taoism with Buddhism and the mixing of the concepts of Buddhahood with Taoist-style immortality, this idea increasingly began to be visualized as creating a spiritual immortal body from Jing known as Shengtai, the sagely embryo in the abdomen, well, really the lower dantian, that would then be born by being sent out from the body. Therefore, this was seen as a form of immortality by rebirth. But even back in the Tao Te Ching, we already see Lao Tzu made repeated mentions of becoming as a newborn child. Lao Tzu specifically relates the newborn's longevity and vitality to the suppleness and moldability of their body, as opposed to the hardness and strength of the body of an adult, which would also be in line to Seimei Kikan being a path to longevity or even immortality by being a technique that makes the body fully controllable, fully moldable. And this notion of Seimei Kikan, life return, rebirth, being tied to Shan-style immortality, which is hinted at by Kumadori's speech, is completed through Kureha's use of the technique to halt her aging process. But we'll get more into that later. Now, there's another reason why this technique would be known by rebirth. So, using your Haki to control your physical body, to control Jing, can be seen as just a subset of that breath Haki that we talked about, right? Instead of using your Haki to control external elements, you control your very body. Now, how did Zoro gain control over this breath Haki again? Of course, by becoming aware of the breath of non-sentient things when he was extremely close to death. Thus, awakening Seimei Kikan would likely require one to have a near-death experience, therefore dying and being reborn. Now, Luffy has used a technique of fast digestion that is extremely similar to Seimei Kikan at various times throughout the story. But outside of maybe, if really stretched, this gag in Alabasta where he makes a lot of fruit disappear by eating them really fast, the first time Luffy ever uses this ability is in Impel Down after surviving Magellan's poison. This is when Luffy came his closest to death that he has ever been. And yes, it was worse than how he was when he awakened his fruit. If you don't remember, Ivankov had to pour in hormones into Luffy's body that caused him immense suffering and overloaded his body so much that it took 10 years of his lifespan, all of this to raise his chances of survival from 0% to 2%. The process that Luffy had to endure to survive Magellan's poison while under the effect of Ivankov's hormones was so gruesome that it had Bonkley screaming and crying, begging for Ivankov to do something from just barely seeing it happen for a second. And it's not a coincidence that it is precisely after this near-death experience that we see Luffy using Seimei Kikan for the first time. The use of Seimei Kikan's fast digestion here is made very clear. It is very deliberately shown to us. Oda brings the reader's attention to how skinny and emaciated Luffy is, to how he seemingly has lost any fat and muscle mass that he had, in contrast with the giant massive food that he's just eaten. And then our attention is brought to how quickly he absorbs that food, to how those nutrients move through his body in this very unnatural way, becoming his lost muscle mass. It is here that Ivankov gives the answer to Hiroruk's questioning about the nature of miracles. According to Ivankov, it is all about someone's willpower, that miracles only come for those that never give up. it is made explicitly clear by Ivankov that his willpower is the only thing that can guarantee his survival here. And if we're talking about controlling your body in a miraculous way, in a way that should be impossible, via willpower, we must be talking about some form of Seimei Kikan. Note here that what each character was trying to accomplish during this near-death experience determines what kind of breath they learn and what kind of ability they gain. Zoro was focused on the environment around him. He was focused on understanding the materials around him to find the secret to cutting them. And so it is the breath of the stones, the trees, and the iron around him that he learns. Luffy was focused on ensuring his survival and healing as fast as possible so that he could go and save Ace. He was trying to help along and to speed this process that, according to Ivankov, was about destroying his body and rebuilding it. Thus, he learns the breath of his own body and how to control it to help along in rebuilding it, in rebuilding tissue, which is exactly what fast digestion is about, taking in nutrients and rapidly using them to rebuild your body. And so it is precisely this technique of fast digestion from Seimei Kikan that Luffy gains. Interestingly, though it happens through a completely different mechanism, we have a similar theme play out with Luffy's Devil Fruit Awakening. He, quote-unquote, dies and then is reborn from this near-death experience with a body that is fully moldable, fully under the control of his spirit. Then, you also have the fact that Chopper related Seimei Kikan to biofeedback when he had the ability explained to him by Kumadori. Biofeedback is the name for a broad group of techniques where measuring devices are used to give real-time information to an individual, typically a medical patient, about the behavior of one or more of their bodily functions, like for example their heartbeat, so that through this feedback the person can over time become able to exert some control over a bodily function that is normally involuntary, like the rate of their heartbeat.
Biofeedback is a training system. It's a training system where you can get control of your nervous system and you can get full control of your breath. Biofeedback allows you to see what you're doing to yourself, through your breath, through your muscle tension on a screen, and then work with the biofeedback therapist in order to get control of this and bring yourself back into a state of calmness.
Similarly here, it is by gaining the ability to sense their body and their bodily functions by sensing their breath that the individual can gain the power to control them via Seimei Kikan. But is this really all it takes? Is the secret to Kureha's youth simply Seimei Kikan? It can't be. You see, despite Laoji using Seimei Kikan and claiming that his use of it can fight old age, and repeatedly using the title of Immortal Warrior, his entire recurring gag was about how old and how near death he was. Yet Laoji is actually only 72 years old. To put this into perspective, this is younger than Garp, Rayleigh, Sengoku, Don Chinjiao, and about half of Kureha's age. When you have the guy explicitly named and themed around Lao Tzu, using the technique directly inspired and themed around the Taoist internal alchemy techniques for immortality, and explicitly saying that they can be used for immortality, and still he clearly isn't able to stop his aging, I'm pretty sure that Oda is telling us that this stuff doesn't really work, even in the world of One Piece. Remember what I said when talking about the metaphysics of the world of One Piece, that Oda borrows from Taoism or these other ancient traditions, but puts it through a lens of modern science? So what is the big difference between Laoji and Kureha? What is it that Kureha has that Laoji lacks? Of course, it's the medical knowledge. Kureha is certainly one of the best medical doctors in the entire One Piece world. Likely the best. In the reality of modern science, we know that longevity is actually not determined by some essence stored in the kidneys, much less one that you can preserve by practicing Qigong and doing No Nut November. In reality, aging is an incredibly complicated biological process, involving cell senescence, telomere shortening, genetic mutations, epigenetics, exhaustion of stem cells, and much more, a process that not even modern science fully understands. Even if you are able to fully control your body with your willpower, only someone like Kureha and her near unparalleled medical knowledge could know exactly what to control and how to control in her body to stop aging. As Kureha said so herself, without the medical knowledge, you can't save a single person, and that includes yourself. So, in the same way that the idea of the Panacea is related to those legends of the elixir of immortality, and that Chopper's master, Kureha, was able to achieve some form of immortality via Seimei Kikan, it seems fitting that this is where Chopper's ability to become a doctor that can cure anything will be found. Which is also fitting given that Seimei Kikan was first explained to us by Kumadori when talking to Chopper. Except of course it wouldn't be Chopper's own body that he would have to control, but rather the body of the patient, which should be substantially more difficult. It's one thing to attune your Haki to the breath of your own body that you are likely more or less familiar with unconsciously by merely just existing. It's another thing completely to be able to attune it to the body of someone else and not have it clash in a bad way with the patient's own ki, their own spirit, their own energy. What I like about this idea, first of all, is that it wouldn't be some magical healing energy that would go against the themes of his backstory of the importance of medical knowledge and that would make his training under Kureha obsolete. Rather, it would be a medical tool like any other, and its efficacy to treat the seemingly untreatable would be entirely dependent on Chopper's own medical knowledge to know the specific ways that he should change and manipulate the patient's body in order to cure them. It's a medical tool like any other, even if an extremely powerful one. Like a scalpel is just as likely to save a life when in the hands of a great surgeon as it is to take one when in the hands of a fool, which is likely what happened to Lao Ji. To further the irony, Lao Ji's own reckless usage of the technique without understanding anything about the biology of his own body is likely to be the very reason why he seems to have aged so rapidly. I mean, when you think about it, he said that his technique was to store away his youthful muscle to use later in life. So basically for decades, this guy had been taking away his youthful muscle and storing it so that when he's old, he can use it to temporarily turn extremely buff. Like, of course he aged badly. I mean, what the hell did this guy think was gonna happen? In the way that the ability would necessitate for Chopper to perfectly attune his own Haki to the body and breath of the patient, it would necessitate the kind of powerful will to be a doctor that can cure anything and that seeks to cure people for their own sake rather than some kind of monetary reward that he inherited from Hiruruk. And following Ivankov's view on miracles, if according to Ivankov, miracles can only be brought about by willpower, and the miracle that managed to save Luffy's life, even in the face of seemingly impossible conditions, was his use of Seimei Kikan to help the healing of his body, then by controlling his patient's body with his Haki in a similar way to Seimei Kikan, Chopper will be the miracle worker that even Ivankov couldn't be, capable of performing the kind of miracles that Hiruruk enthusiastically spoke about. And fittingly, he would do so by flowing his Haki into the patient's body, that is, by using his cherry blossom flow, completing the symbolism of the cherry blossom that connects him with Hiruruk. At the same time, the power's usefulness would be entirely dependent on his medical knowledge, the medical knowledge that he gained from Kureha and the medical knowledge that he gained on his own, following on her footsteps with her view that without the medical knowledge you can't save anybody. In this way, this power would be the perfect combination and realization of the ideals he inherited from his two mentors. Diable Jambe, arguably Sanji's signature technique, where he envelops his legs in flames to enhance the power of his kicks. The source of this fire is a topic of debate amongst the fandom, but it is stated directly by Sanji and heavily implied by Oda himself to be Sanji's burning passion. And yeah, my view is that this is precisely the case, that this is a form of nature haki, where Sanji is able to emulate the breath of fire by tapping into his burning passion. But this must be a retcon, right? Because when Sanji first used this technique against Jabra in Enya's lobby, he did so by spinning on his leg to heat it up via friction, right? Except, no, this wasn't the case even back then. So remember how I said that Zoro became able to cut fire through Foxfire style, yet we haven't seen him create any flames like Kinemon? Notice here that what Sanji creates with his spinning is just sparks, and the large flames that envelop his leg only appear after he has stopped spinning. At first, Sanji likely learned that he could control flames, especially their intensity, through willpower, but he could not conjure flames out of nothing, so he spins to create an initial spark that he can then fuel with his burning passion. As Sanji progresses and his mastery over the technique grows, we see that he becomes able to create these flames without the need to create that original spark from friction, thus removing his need to spin altogether. With the recurring epithets, bounties, the million reaction faces, and an abundance of off-screening, it's easy to see Oda's writing as having a lot of telling and not as much showing. But that is not really the case for Haki. With Haki, it has been a lot of show and very little tell. And this is what makes the whole thing so difficult to piece together. But it makes sense not only from a writing standpoint, as in it avoids boring the audience with extremely long technical explanations of the inner workings of this power system, but it makes sense also in story, given what Haki is and what kind of characters we mostly deal with in One Piece. This is a world of pirates, of fighters, of adventurers. They don't necessarily care about all the technical details, all the philosophy behind how these powers work. When it comes to Qigong, it's easy to spend an immense amount of time researching all the theory and philosophy about it. But is this really necessary for practicing it? Qi is an aspect of a person's body, and the practice of its control happens in the sphere of one's subjective experience. Qigong is about control of one's body and spirit. A user of Qigong or a user of Haki doesn't have to understand all these theoretical inner workings to know what using Haki feels like and to learn how to use that power on command. A lot of people are just born with an innate ability to use certain forms of Haki, and One Piece is filled with examples of people using Haki unconsciously. Haki is mostly learned by experience, and this is how so many people could use variations of a fourth Haki that they don't even know exist and never come to the conclusion that a fourth form of Haki exists. A great example is Sanji's Diable Jambe, or the more current Electro Jambe. Just like Usopp doesn't need to know about observation Haki to use it in Dressrosa, Sanji doesn't need to know about the breath of all things or about the Scholar of Breath to know what fire feels like to him and to know that he can emulate and draw forth this kind of breath, this kind of aspect of fire through his burning passion, as he states to Queen and as stated by Oda himself. It's likely even that Sanji familiarized himself with, connected with, the breath of fire unconsciously over time from handling it for his cooking, and eventually realized, probably by accident, that he could affect the fire through his will, through his passion. Loads of people through experience can come to learn how to emulate the breath of specific things without really realizing that this is a form of Haki, and much less that all the seemingly different powers are actually one and the same, without knowing that the reason that they can draw out this power is because of the fact that all things have a breath. All of these powers would seem unrelated to them, just like they largely seem unrelated to the One Piece community itself. Whereas for a guy like Zoro, who knows about the breath of all things, he can more easily apply the same concept to then learn how to control a completely different breath. Unlike Sanji, who largely only applies the breath of fire, Zoro, by knowing the unifying factor behind these powers, can more easily apply it to learn and develop techniques to control the breath of different things. For example, you know one thing that never made a lot of sense to me? When Zoro suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, in Skypiea, starts to use long-range attacks. But it isn't out of nowhere. This is after he had learned about the breath of all things in Alabasta. Chapter 259 is when we see for the first time Zoro use such an attack. Now pay attention to how much focus on the wind there is in this chapter. Right on the first panel we have the trees and the grass rustling with the wind. The fight takes place in this grassy plateau where there is this near constant focus on the way the wind blows through the grass. Braham uses wind expelled from dials as a main feature of his fighting style, something that is directly noted by Zoro. We see Zoro drawing in his breath before performing this kind of whirlwind type motion, taking back our attention to this notion of breath, so that then we can finally see Zoro release his long range attack, very clearly portrayed like a whirlwind created from his sword. Notice how the wind from this attack changes the direction of the grass the same way we had seen the wind do throughout this entire chapter. This whole encounter seems roughly based on the story of Yamato Takeru and the grass-cutting sword. And yes, Yamato partially named after this guy, which is why his kanabo is named Takeru. Similarly to Zoro here, Yamato Takeru was ambushed by enemies in the middle of a grassy plateau. The enemies set the grass around him on fire. Surrounded by encroaching flames, Yamato Takeru is able to save himself from the flames and defeat his enemies when he realizes that his sword can control the wind. He then uses the wind to blow the fire towards his enemies, defeating them. By the way, the reason why this sword is magical is that, according to legend, the sword was found in one of the tales of the 8-headed serpent Yamata no Orochi, and yes, Orochi, based on this, when it was slain by Susanoo, the Shinto god of the sea, storms, and fields. Susanoo names the sword Ame no Murakumo no Tsuguri, meaning heavenly sword of gathering clouds, and gives it to his sister Amaterasu, the Shinto goddess of the sun, who he was in bad terms with, as an apology. The sword would later be passed down through generations of Amaterasu's followers, and eventually is gifted to Yamato Takeru by his aunt Yamato Hime, or Princess Yamato, who was the highest Shinto priestess of Amaterasu. This sword is said to be one of the 3 imperial regalia of Japan, and among all the swords of Japanese legends, I would say this is probably the most legendary. Now notice that Yamato's clothes are almost identical to the traditional clothes of Shinto priestesses, that Yamato as a child was called the Onihime, the Oni princess, and that Yamato's backstory, being thrown into the cave with a samurai, seems based on a legend of Amaterasu, where Amaterasu hides herself inside of a cave for days, casting the world into darkness. So notice here that at the same time, Oda puts references to Yamato Takeru in Zoro, he puts references to Yamato Hime in Yamato. So does that mean that at some point Yamato will be gifting Zoro some incredibly legendary sword? Well, considering that last video I say that Yamato will turn out to have specialized in the Kitetsu school of blacksmithing, known primarily for creating the Kitetsu blades, then of course Yamato would at some point smith a Kitetsu blade for Zoro. Because Zoro had learned about the breath of all things and how to utilize this power with his swordsmanship in Alabasta, by the time we get to this scene in Skypiea, Zoro has developed a long-range technique by utilizing the breath of air. And he keeps developing it further, because after the time skip in Fishmen Island, we see him use a more advanced wind technique to create a tornado, and even the breath of his body. Though he didn't initially learn it during his fight with Mr. One, in Enya's lobby we already see him using some degree of muscle mass control, the gorillas, similar to Laoji's Qigong and Lucci's own use of Seimei Kikan. Notice how once again Oda draws the reader's attention to Zoro's breathing before he performs this technique, hinting at its true nature. There's also his finishing move on Ryuma's corpse in Thriller Bark that sets it on fire. But wait a minute, didn't I just say that Zoro only learned the Breath of Flames from observing Kinemon's Foxfire style, and that we haven't even seen him create flames yet, but I don't think he used the Breath of Fire here at all. Notice how Zoro's sword itself is never on fire. Rather, it is only Ryuma's corpse that starts burning after he has been cut. In this way, it is very similar to Shura's heat javelin in Skypiea. If you don't remember, Shura, one of Enel's priests, had a bird with a flame dial installed in its mouth, allowing it to breathe fire. But Shura's lance, heat javelin, instead was equipped with a heat dial. And so, even though it would never be on fire itself, it would get so hot that any flammable thing that it pierced would catch on fire. Zoro's finishing move against Ryuma is pretty much identical to this, meaning to me that he was simply using the breath of heat to heat up his sword rather than the breath of fire. Shura, by the way, is another word in Japan for Ashura. Zoro just in general uses many variations of nature haki throughout the story. Honestly, a whole reread of the story since his fight with Mr. One would probably be necessary to find and categorize them all. Feels kinda weird saying this about a haki color that I'm theorizing to exist, but I would say it's his most used shade of haki, the one he specializes in. And what can I say? It suits him. Its themes fit his story and personality, and it's a power that connects him back to his first master Koshiro, Kuina's father, to Shimotsuki village, and thus also to Wano and to his Shimotsuki samurai roots. We have seen plenty of flying air slashes being used as well, like for example Rankyaku, the Stormlight from Rokushiki, and yeah, these are also probably uses of the Breath of Air. It's no wonder here that Zoro's Pound Phoenix and Kaku's Rankyaku are almost exact mirrors of each other in this scene, because they're basically the same thing. Also, I'm not sure if you remember, but in the first video I say that what enables imbuement, that is to flow your haki into a weapon or a projectile or whatever, is not really that it is solid, but that you can attune your own haki to it, causing it to be attracted and bound to it. So if you are changing the nature of your haki to match that of some natural element, it seems logical that you should be able to imbue your haki on it. Like for example, if you create a flying air slash, shouldn't you be able to coat it with armament? And why not Conquerors if you can use Conquerors coating? And this might be precisely what Divine Departure is. A flying air slash coated with Conquerors haki. Now, let's try to remember all that stuff I said about the void, about Wuji, or about the Tao. This fundamental principle that permeates everything, creates material reality itself, and that can also be referred to as the sky or heaven. I did say that this is something that also exists in the world of One Piece, right? Oh, here we perhaps find our first evidence of it. See, if you can change the nature of your haki to match the breadth of other things around you, and thus interact and control those things, could you perhaps use the same power to interact with the void itself? Well, there is one ability that, if we are to interpret literally, the very limited explanation that we got for it should be precisely this. I'm talking about Geppo, or Moonstep. You know, the double jump ability amongst the 6 techniques. The most intuitive explanation, looking at how it behaves, would be that it is performed by kicking the air, and thus would probably be an use of the color of nature to interact with the breath of air. Yet this is not how this ability is described at all. In the original Japanese, when Blue Eno is demonstrating Rokushiki in Water 7, the only explanation that he gives for Geppo is that they can kick the sky or kick the void to float. But not only that, the specific reading that Oda uses here is not Sora, which is what one would normally use when talking about the sky, but rather he uses the reading Ku, which is more appropriately used to mean void or emptiness, like the void element in Godai, also known as Akasha, or the Buddhist concept of emptiness, also known as Sunyata. So if we are to accept the Blue Eyed description, which is the only one we have, as crazy as that might sound, Geppo is literally walking on the void. But is there any other implication to this than that one would be able to use this ability in empty space, if they find themselves in that situation for some reason? Well, I am reminded of the first description we get of nature Haki via Zoro's flashback during his fight with Mr. One of his master Koshiro, in which Koshiro specifically says that the swordsmen who can cut iron are also the ones who can cut nothing. And so I'm reminded of a theory that I read on some comment on Reddit, I think, that Zoro would at some point literally cut nothing, which I guess he would be able to do if he is to cut the void. But how this be useful in battle? Yeah, I don't know actually. As you can see, this is an incredibly expensive power, and there are so many different abilities in the series that could perhaps be attributed to it. For example, Rokugan from Rokushiki. Luffy says that it feels exactly like an impact dial, just much more powerful. I've seen people speculate that it is armament emission. I think it could easily be just impact, essentially mimicking the effect of an impact or reject dial. There's also stuff like Mech Guy from the Whitebeard Pirates who could electrify his sword, could be a use of the breath of electricity. There are a lot of different fire users that could perhaps be using the breath of fire, etc. This video here is not by any means meant to cover all of them, and you are free to use this theory to cook with whatever power you think could use it as an explanation. So next video will focus on armament Haki, obviously explaining the basics of how it works, the difference between regular armament and hardening, what's that black coating supposed to be, emission, internal destruction, and also a full explanation on how Gear Fort works. Anyways, that's it for this video. Ciao!